Okay, dear colleagues, dear friends from Geneva, New York, and all over the world, welcome to this event to celebrate this year's Human Rights Day. I am the German ambassador to the UN in Geneva and will moderate this event. 2020 marks the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. Throughout the course of the year, the UN75 office has conducted a global consultation with the objective to understand people's opinions about the future of the UN as an institution and about the key challenges and opportunities facing the organization in the 21st century. Today, we will look at the question, are human rights still a priority for the peoples of the United Nations? And we also want to delve a little deeper into the findings of the UN75 Global Survey and Report. We all know the United Nations is unique, the embodiment of multilateralism, and the only truly global organization that covers all aspects of international politics. Today, the world is confronted with a whole set of challenges, which we can only tackle together. The pandemic is the most recent case. Also, environmental issues, climate, water, the role of digitalization obviously call for a global answer. And all of them have a strong link to human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, are human rights still a priority? That is the theme of our dialogue today. For Germany, human rights are at the core of our foreign policy. The reason is simple. Long-term peace and security, as well as sustainable development, are not possible where human rights are violated. In contrast, where human rights are protected, the conditions are set to live in freedom and prosperity. This link between the three main objectives of the UN, peace and security, development, and human rights, was so prominently put forward by Kofi Annan in his report in 2005 called Enlarge Freedom. It has to be acted on if we are to be successful. We believe that this will not be possible without a multilateral effective framework. Now, to take the discussion forward, I have the pleasure to introduce our panelists. Ilse Brandts-Keres, Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. She is the representative of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in New York. Her Excellency Yvette Stevens, member of the Board of Trustees of the Universal Rights Group and Chair Rapporteur on the contribution of the Human Rights Council to prevention. Ms. Marcella Manubens, Global Vice President for International Social Sustainability at Unilever. And finally, Mrs. Akuzua Agiepong, a youth activist from Ghana. One last remark before we get going. UN75 has been all about participation, and we would also like you to engage. The UN75 campaign has made use of a new and innovative educational gaming platform called Kahoot. Through questions, quizzes, and polls, UN75 has engaged more than 300,000 people. Today is your chance to test your human rights knowledge and share your thoughts on the future. If you would like to participate, you can find the information in the chat box. Now, as first speaker, I turn to Under-Secretary General Fabrizio Hochschild, who will brief us on the results of the Global Survey and the UN75 report. Mr. Hochschild, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Warm greetings to all and a very happy Human Rights Day. And I'm particularly proud to be on the same panel as some current and former colleagues, notably Yvette Stevens, with whom I had the honor to work for many years in UNHCR. As the ambassador elucidated, the Secretary General, even before COVID, thought that the way the world was drifting made it not so appropriate to turn the 75th anniversary of the UN into a large celebration. Instead, in light of this paradox between an ever-growing number of global challenges and a declining will to work through the institutions and mechanisms that were set up after the Second World War to deal with global challenges, the Secretary General thought it was we needed to go out again to we the peoples, the people to whom we're ultimately accountable for, and understand how they see the priorities of the world and what their expectations are of international cooperation, and bring that back to the institution as a sort of reality check, and also to get new inspiration from those to whom ultimately we're accountable. So we did this global listening exercise around 4 questions. What is the future you want? What do you see as the biggest threats to that future? What are your immediate priorities for post-COVID recovery? And what are your expectations of international cooperation? And we got about 1.5 million responses from all 193 member states. We also did independent scientific surveys in 50 indicative member states to make sure that our more opportunistic survey method was corresponded in its findings to more scientific approaches. And then we did AI data streams, including reaching out to academia and think tanks, was remarkably convergent. The results were very human rights aligned, and there was nothing in the questions or in the way we framed the debate to make that the case. And I think that's very striking. In terms of post-COVID priorities, the overwhelming focus is on the realization of socio and economic rights. What people want to see first and foremost for post-COVID recovery is better access to fundamental services, better access to healthcare, better access to education, better access to clean water and sanitation. That is universally the overwhelming priority for post-COVID recovery. And it's followed very closely behind by calls for better dealing with inequality. I think COVID has really laid bare, as well as exacerbating, pre-existing inequalities. And there's a very strong call to adjust our economies to make them more inclusive and to better tackle inequality. Incidentally, also a call to do much more about corruption, which is seen as fueling inequality. With regard to longer term priorities, in most parts of the world, the top priority was better dealing with climate change and the destruction we're doing to our environment. But that was followed up closely by calls for more respect for human rights and human dignity, in particular in the context of armed conflict, and in particular in the context of poverty. And in some regions, notably the Middle East and North Africa, the call for human rights was ahead of call for action on climate change. But there's no doubt, together with climate change and safeguarding our environment, that the call for human rights, especially in the context of conflict and in the context of poverty and inequality, is a top priority. What I found striking, in the UN, and I hope I'm not being too indiscreet here, but the tendency in the UN can often be not to disregard human rights, but to treat it with a certain degree of caution, because it inevitably too often puts you in a degree of friction or adversity with our key stakeholders, member states. So, human rights can too often be seen as something that, of course, we have to uphold, but that is a little bit uncomfortable to take on. Now, what I found very striking is when it comes to perceptions of the UN, and this comes not from our own survey, but from the independent work done by the Pew Foundation and Edelman, the UN is most associated with human rights. So that is both according to the Pew and Edelman survey, that is where the UN is seen to be performing strongest. So, you know, I think it's a little risky for us internally to disregard it as a priority when in the eyes of the world, this is the main added value of our institution. So to sum up, I think one can draw three conclusions with regard to human rights from this unprecedented global reality check we did. The first is that aspirations for human rights are truly universal. I mean, you know, in the current very politicized context, too often we hear that they're associated with one particular region. We saw no sign of that at all. Secondly, that in the current context, especially against the backdrop of COVID, the most pressing demand is for better realization of socio and economic rights, and in particular, the right to health, the right to education. And in that context, deep worries with growing inequality and exclusion. And thirdly, this is an area where the UN is seen and recognized as adding global added value, and therefore an area that, far from treating with a degree of unease, we should be embracing and furthering, because that is very much what we the peoples want, as evidenced through our global outreach exercise. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hochschild, and thank you for being so succinct. And I think the messages are very strong, and they are really something to think and discuss about. And that is why I turn to Mrs. Brans-Keres, the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. We just heard that the UN75 report suggests that improvements in the enjoyment of human rights is a priority around the world. So, Mrs. Brans-Keres, does it surprise you that this is a fact, and in particular also that the issues of health, water, education, and climate-related human rights are mentioned as a priority in this area? So there is, of course, in Geneva, a discussion we continuously have around the question, are all human rights equal? Are they all of the same importance? Or do we first have to achieve a certain set of human rights, and a different set might be coming after the first one has been realized? So, Mrs. Brans-Keres, would you want to comment on this, please?
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and I'm so grateful to the organizers for allowing, and in particular also for the brilliant introduction we heard from Fabrizio, that certainly is inspiring, I think, and that of course is due to the results of the surveys and the work done. I'm not surprised actually at all that human rights is a top priority for the global citizenry. But I do, and following up on what Fabrizio said about how we should take that to heart and be encouraged by it, I also think that it's a signal to member states. We have, particularly in the context that we now have had for so many years, saying that there's this pushback against human rights, and we have been defensive about human rights. And of course, this is such a strong signal that maybe it's in the member states should remember it's in their own best interest. Their own citizenry is actually requesting better implementation of human rights. So I find that very encouraging. We know that the UN was established precisely to save us from the scourge of war, but to also to reaffirm faith in fundamental rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person. Those are the very first opening lines of the preamble of the UN Charter, as we know, and that sets out, of course, several articles on the human rights mandate as it is there. But since then, the whole adaptation, the adoption of the Universal Declaration and the leading role that the UN has had in the global efforts in developing international standards, the whole system of human rights protection with all its mechanisms to support states to uphold and to implement and promote human rights is, of course, a very visible and very strong action that the UN has been involved with and has achieved. So it's been truly global in the movement. We know that already a lot of those developments were driven by the people, by civil society, by human rights movements. For instance, spearheading also through the global protests that we had, and also strong civil society organizations' roles in this, in speaking out against human rights abuses in Latin America, that drove the drafting of the Convention Against Torture, and also established were instrumental in establishing the first special procedure mandate holder, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. So we've seen this movement and the role of the people and the support of the people for this already in these years. Also, the ensuring the individual well-being really covers all spheres, as we know, the education, health, social security, protection from torture, from ill treatment, the whole range of protections. That this is really the UN human rights mandate, and that does speak directly to we, the people. And the aspiration of it. We also see with COVID the interconnectedness of the various rights, the stress on the social economic ones, as was just mentioned, of course, is key right now. But we also have seen how they truly interrelated the rights are, civil, political, as well as economic, cultural, and social. To your prompting, Your Excellency, I really do think that there is the no hierarchy, of course, of rights, but as we develop our understanding of the rights, we clearly also, there are new issues and new challenges that come on. But we see even in the other priorities that the survey points to, in climate, for instance, and health, those, of course, as was pointed out, are very strongly related to human rights in themselves as well. And COVID certainly is also exactly showing why, in practice, we need multilateral action to respond to it. So I think that it all comes together if we see also the opportunity from COVID to building back, recovering better into the future. Lastly, I wanted to mention the Secretary General's call to action for human rights that was launched in February. That is really a way to frame the responsibility throughout the UN system of all of the parts of the UN to make sure that human rights are really at the center, front and center of all UN action. And that also corresponds, I think, to this demand that we have seen in this survey. Certainly also reinvigorating the aspirations of the Charter and the Universal Declaration in light of these new challenges and opportunities that we have, the climate, as was mentioned, digital technologies, those are also part of the priorities that the Secretary General set in the call to action. Participation is a very important one, civic space, that's another one. And here we are very happy to work and feed this whole result of the surveys and report into the future work as we're doing it. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Okay. Before I ask you a second question, Isa, I would like to make one remark, and that is the whole discussion about the human rights today creates the impression that we are backtracking on human rights, that worldwide the human rights situation is getting worse and worse. And I would like to suggest that we shouldn't just be looking at the weak points, we should look at successes as well, because that reinvigorates us and helps us in moving forward. And I actually believe that, you know, looking back at the last 30 years or even longer, globally, we've achieved tremendous successes. And of course, today we look with much greater transparency and unrelentlessly at the weak points. But I think many of those weak points were there before. We didn't speak about them as much. And if you look at individual rights and the situation around the world, of course, in a majority of countries, the situation has greatly improved. There's no doubt about it. So I think that is also a story to tell. And my second question to you relates to what Fabrizio Hochschild said as the last point of his conclusions, that people associate the United Nations in particular with human rights protection. So this leads me to the question, how do you reconcile the prominence of UN human rights in people's minds with a reality in which human rights are often sidelined and in which the UN only receives about 3% of the UN regular budget in the Human Rights Department? Could you explain that?
Well, thank you very much. I wish I could explain it, because I do think that that is actually, it's a very strong sign that there is a disconnect. And I think that really here again, we have the opportunity from the study to take it as a wake-up call for this. The underfunding of the UN Human Rights Program is a very long-standing challenge, as we know. And that is a challenge for us to, and the whole system, the organization, to effectively deliver on its human rights mandate. For us, for OHCHR, the regular budget allocation, it really has remained the same and even been under pressure to be reduced for many years. Fabrizio was mentioning Kofi Annan's reform program from 2005 after the World Summit outcome report, where he called for doubling OHCHR regular budget resources over the next 5 years, with a view to progressively setting a balance between regular budget and voluntary contributions to its resources. But still, we see the situation and the challenge continuing since then, and we continue to have the human rights pillar, as was mentioned, the 3 pillars, one of the pillars, but we still continue to represent only 3.7% at most of the regular budget of the UN. And that means that for us, more or less 2/3 of the resources that we need for the minimum work as we're doing it and trying to do it as effectively and I think efficiently and I think successfully, efficiently as possible, but still voluntary contributions continue to represent about 2/3 of the needed resources and only 1/3 from the regular budget. So this, of course, is a huge problem. I think, again, there is the decision making, and of course, the member states also hopefully will heed the call that we have from this information here and the report that was done, particularly with the public health crisis and now with COVID, when the human rights have been propelled really to the forefront and in the recognition of everyone. And this is what we see, that our budgetary challenges, we've had a lot of more work to do on it as well. We have been able to adjust nimbly and effectively to address the key issues also in concerning COVID-19 through guidance, technical guidance, various tools that we have been producing directly, practically, to addressing and focusing specifically on vulnerable people or people in vulnerable situations, minority groups, women and others. But this is, of course, an urgent situation where we see that addressing the budget issues to give us the resources so that we're able to do this work and to do it effectively, to make sure that it really translates into real action in the field. And this is assistance to the member states to do it. We're not doing something against member states. To the contrary, this is exactly providing the tools that are needed for better implementation of human rights. So I don't have the answer of why it has been this way, but here, even if again with the Secretary General's call to action, we're now saying, and it's clear that all of the UN is responsible also for making sure that all actions are based in human rights. But the bottom line is that, of course, we need to strengthen the regular budget's allocation to human rights. And this is a core purpose of the UN, and I think we all need to step up to take that responsibility. And of course, it's a call of urgency to member states as well in those deliberations around the regular budget. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ilse. You mentioned the member states, I think, 5 times in your answer. I do think we have a shared responsibility here. And I've said this on other occasions. It is also very important that the Secretary General plays a role in directing the attention to this fact that we are underfunded in the Human Rights Department. It is a very common phenomenon on many issues in the UN that the membership is split on certain issues. But if the Secretary General doesn't play a leading role here and doesn't put the right figures in the budget project, it becomes a very difficult discussion for those who want to increase this. So also to Fabrizio Hochschild, maybe you can use all your insights you have gained from your report to make an extra argument in debates that are taking place internally. And I know Yvette Stevens very well understands this, having seen the debates we've had in Geneva before. So thank you for your answers. Before turning to our second panelist, I would like to inform our audience that we will have a Q&A segment after the panel discussion. So please raise your hand if you would like to take the floor. And you can also share your questions and comments on the chat. Now I would like to turn to our second panelist, Ms. Akuzua Agyepong. Sorry for probably mispronouncing your name. You are joining us from Ghana, and you are a youth activist, as I already have mentioned. The youth that was surveyed in the UN75 report seems to be more optimistic about the future than the older generation. That's good. They attach great importance to human rights, such as access to education, healthcare, and water and sanitation, as well as to civil and political rights. Ms. Agyepong, what do you think about these results, and how can such youthful optimism be leveraged for human rights advocacy?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. And don't worry about my name, it's quite a mouthful sometimes, so that is absolutely fine. The first thing I'd say is to our attendees and people watching, please go out and actually read this report, because it has so much evidence of the current happenings within our world today that we need to, read for ourselves and see. I think the first thing that stands out for me is the sheer number of young people that were a part of this survey. And that tells you that young people are speaking up and want to be engaged more. So we just don't want our voices to be heard, but we also want to be on the forefront, changing things and being right there with the leadership to make things change. And so to see that young people are optimistic about the future, I mean, it's not something that we didn't know. Like, it's, for me, even though young people are the most disproportionately affected by several human rights abuses and crises in our world today, they are still very optimistic about the futures that exist in the opportunities that exist in our future today. And it is essentially very important for us to highlight that the future holds so many opportunities that we need to start thinking of how to take advantage of. And so when we look at the question that says that, how can youthful optimism and drive be leveraged for human rights advocacy, as you rightfully asked, the second part, if we go back to the UN Secretary General's strategy on youth, in the first priority and the fourth priority, that pretty much answers our question there. Because in the first priority in the document, it talks about amplifying youth voices for the promotion of a peaceful, just, and sustainable world. And the fourth priority talks about protecting and promoting the rights of young people and supporting their political and civic engagement. And so there is a need. And so the UN, first and foremost, the UN recognizes how to really engage young people and to ensure that their optimism and their energies and capacities are leveraged for us to build a sustainable future in which human rights are respected. But also it's something that we need to keep on talking about, the need to have young people in all of the processes to be at the forefront of discussions, to be right there at the table. Because every single day, things like child marriage, political unrest, and all of these things, even in the area of healthcare, the things that affect young people, these affect them deeply and pretty much so in a huge manner, right? And so if these are disproportionately affecting young people, then they should be part of the processes to actually change these things. And so I feel that very much so, the strategy talks to us about how to leverage the optimism to change things around for young people in the area of human rights. And we should refer to that and ensure that in all of the processes, and rightfully so, as was done in the survey, to ensure that young people were part of the process and their voices are heard, that we continue moving that agenda along, but beyond hearing of their voices, also engaging them. One thing that we would note is that COVID-19 has turned things around. We're able to have this conversation because we are using Zoom. And our future is going to be one that is going to be heavily based on technologies such as these. And who are the age groups that are, which age group is driving such technologies? Which age groups are driving such innovations? And that is young people. And so if we're going to move into that future, that means the future we're moving into is one that is built for the young person. And we need to ensure that the young people are prepared and are preparing for that future and are prepared to lead that kind of future and are prepared to ensure that even in the area of human rights, that they are right there ensuring those human rights for themselves and their own future generations.
Thank you for that answer. I think you're absolutely right in saying that it is going to be much easier technically to make your voice heard. But of course, we all need to inform ourselves, and the younger generation, for them, it is a particular challenge to really understand what's going on in the UN and how to influence the process and to make qualified interventions there. My second question to you concerns the role of the United Nations. Do you, from your perspective as a young person, see a greater role that the UN could in future play in the field of human rights?
I'd say absolutely. And again, the report talks about how the UN can do this. And I will highlight two things, right? Firstly is the consistency in applying the moral authority to uphold the UN Charter in terms of accountability, transparency, impartiality, including through better engagement and communication with communities, as well as strengthening implementation of programs and operations, which is captured in the report. And what this means for me is the UN playing the role that we all know it plays, right? In the submission before, we talked about how the United Nations is associated with human rights. And if the United Nations is indeed associated with human rights, we feel that the UN should then pursue this role even more with consistency, applying all parameters to ensure that human rights are ensured within its member states. And also, I would say in cooperation, right? The UN being the facilitator of that cooperation to ensure that countries, be it developed or developing, are adhering to international tenets, global rules, and ensuring that we are cooperating to protect the peoples of the world. Now, in all of these, and as the UN drives this agenda and as the UN drives this conversation, again, we need to have young people at the forefront who are also taking these initiatives and leading them within their communities at the national level and at international levels. And so we need to start engaging that conversation, noting the fact that we have 1.8 billion young people in the world, the greatest number we have ever seen. And we're going to continue to see more and more young people as we go, through the years. And we have to note that every single day, about 20,000 girls under the age of 18 give birth. And other things like FGM, sexual and gender-based violence, rural migration, and all of these things, unemployment, affect the young person's ability to access his or her human rights. And so with the UN driving these conversations and ensuring consistencies and accountabilities, there is a need to ensure that the young person is a part of that conversation so that his or her human rights are safeguarded and protected. Because who better else, or who else is better to talk about the issues of young people by themselves, and who else is better to deal with the issues of human rights that affect young people by themselves? And so even in the higher echelons of leadership at the United Nations, we need to see the young person over there making the submissions and understanding the issues surrounding these human rights issues, and actually helping in solving them for the present and for the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Akosua, you are a very strong voice for the young generation. There's no doubt about it. Let me now turn to Yvette Stevens. She was formerly the ambassador of Sierra Leone in Geneva, so she knows the Geneva playground very well and the Human Rights Council. Ms. Stevens, the UN75 report suggests people around the world are relatively optimistic that their human rights situation will improve in the coming years. Does that surprise you at a time when we often hear from human rights defenders and others, including representatives of governments, that we are moving backwards on the human rights?
Mm-hmm. No, it doesn't surprise me. Why it doesn't surprise me is that there are many things that have happened, that are happening recently, recent happenings, which raise hopes, which bring optimism. For instance, if you look at the Sustainable Development Agenda, you look at the SDGs, which the agenda itself promises that no one will be left behind. And this has taken hold in many countries, and people do believe that this is going to move and is going to make the plight of people better in relation, especially to the social and economic rights. Now, how this optimism, how long it will hold on, would depend on how much countries are going to be able to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are a number of questions, of course, in terms of, capacity to meet those goals. But for now, it's all there. I mean, we are talking about the Sustainable Development Goals with optimism, and people are optimistic that this would make them better. The second thing that we have to look at also, and I don't think we should underplay the successes that we have had in terms of human rights promotion within countries. I would refer particularly to the Universal Periodic Review, where every single country faces the Human Rights Council and goes back with a package of recommendations, and there are some mechanisms to monitor how those recommendations are being implemented. And countries have to come back and give and return to the Human Rights Council to report on how they have been able to meet those recommendations which they have accepted. And we should not underestimate the fact that countries, for many of our countries who never before paid attention to human rights, we now hear it's more increasingly hearing about these recommendations, how we should, I mean, let's look at the question which was raised earlier on relating to women, to the human rights of women, FGM and all that. In our countries before this came out strongly from the work of the Human Rights Council, the Universal Periodic Review, it went on. I mean, people were talking about it, but the pressure to take action to handle it came from the work thanks to the work of the Human Rights Council and the Universal Periodic Review in particular. Some people are skeptical about, say, oh, the Universal Periodic Review, they don't quite believe that it works. But I think a recent report by URG and UNICEF does show that when countries have the necessary assistance they need to implement the recommendations work. A third reason why people are optimistic also relates to what is happening in regions. Many states, particularly in the region I know very well, which is in Africa, have been experiencing economic progress. And this gives to hope that their populations would benefit from this economic progress. Mind you, it still remains very at the level of economic indicators, and how this filters through. So the poorest people in the population would have a lot to do with meeting this optimism or this expectation, which is growing expectation from people. Again, within Africa itself, people are optimistic because the regional organization and sub-regional organizations are giving much more attention to human rights issues, to social and economic rights issues than it was in the past. And I refer to the Africa Agenda 2063. I refer to the African Free Trade Agreement, which would open up prospects for countries to meet their economic and social rights. And also, if you look at Agenda 2063, the whole question of addressing conflicts, the 2020 was, for instance, a call by the African Union to silence the guns, for instance. So a lot is happening which make people optimistic. How long they would remain optimistic would be basically what comes out of all these things that are happening. If they make no difference to people, then this optimism will die.
Yes, I agree very much with your very positive message here, and also with your point you made on the UPR. It's a great success to have the UPR. We've learned a lot from it, and actually we're trying to copy it now for other purposes within the health area. We want a UPR on pandemics, and we are in the midst of discussing this with the WHO. I think I totally agree with you that things are moving in the right direction. I have a second question to you, Ms. Stevens. The UN75 survey found that issues about which people are most optimistic were all human rights related issues. Access to education was on top of that list, closely followed by women's rights, access to healthcare, and freedom of expression. What do you think about the fact that two of those issues are social rights concerns? Does that tell us that the UN should concentrate more on these set of issues?
Yeah. Yes, I think so. I think the UN has to, I mean, I'm happy that this survey took place, and I thank the organizers, thanks my ex-colleague Fabrizio, that this initiative was taken to hear from the people themselves. It is true that, first of all, the health issues, and very interestingly enough, for my part of the world where I come from, you know, we were hit by Ebola, and the African, I mean, I don't want to say I've praised too much what actions have been taken, but we realize it's amazing because every year there would be the WHO conference would be talking about health, access to health, and we believed we had everything covered until the Ebola hit us. And when the Ebola hit us, we realized that our health systems fell flat on their faces. And then we see this sudden recognition that this has to be handled comprehensively. It's not enough for countries to come to W and go back and say, yes, universal health, we're going to do steps, but we needed to take action on it. And I believe that health, now again, we have COVID coming after this, and increasingly we are seeing how important health is. We cannot begin to talk about anything if we cannot ensure that people enjoy the maximum in terms of health. Education. We have seen, I mean, I think somebody who said, I think in Singapore, they made so much progress. And the Singapore leader used to say, education is first, second, third, and fourth. And really, we cannot move on anything at all without education. Many of the things which people are accepting now, we find problems when you have to deal with people who are not educated. Even trying to get them to understand the issues is not easy. Education is so important, not only for the personal well-being, but for the well-being of the whole country. So it doesn't surprise me that suddenly with all this, we are saying, wait a minute, we need to give emphasis, we need to focus on education and health.
Thank you. I would now like to turn to the private sector, a representative of the business community. Ms. Marcella Manubens is, as I said, the Global Vice President for Integrated Social Sustainability at Unilever. Mrs. Manubens, Unilever was a founding member of the UN Global Compact and has integrated human rights policy throughout its business operations. The UN75 report shows that the enjoyment of human rights is a priority aspiration for people around the world. Now the question, is the business sector doing enough to respond to that popular aspiration? Are things moving in the right direction in terms of business efforts to respect and promote human rights? And what more needs to be done? The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come today. Is it moving in the right direction? Yes. Is it moving at the right speed? No. We really need to accelerate. But I will have a little caveat. I don't think that a business or business as a category can address solely the issues. I think that we need to work from a stakeholder point of view. I think that we need to be better connected and better aligned to really work on that together. I think that the progress has been made in terms of transparency. We hear the voices of the most vulnerable in any given supply chain, value chain. I think that the dialogue working with multi-stakeholders has given birth to really important changes, both in the way that business are working and in really truly important transformations to the communities where they operate. I mean, I just can think about the fact that Unilever for many years did the hand washing campaign together with UN agencies, right? And that campaign was really be able to be reactivated in the context of COVID-19 and the last pandemic. So that for me is a really good example of working with purpose and understanding that business is about the community and the people and the lives that you touch. I think that in terms of what more is needed, I think that we need to accelerate this space. I think that we need to a level playing field. Still many of the elements, even if they are legally required, they don't go beyond the transformation that we need to do. The current push of mandatory due diligence is quite a very important push because it brings more of an action as a pressing and a priority, and it will be required. The second element is the financial sector and the market dynamics. I think that the UN is doing quite a significant amount, PRI, to bring that to the forefront. But that also needs to be accelerated. So that transformation and that view that has human rights, it has the social, the environmental, and the economic elements of sustainability together are basically the future. And the third part is that we need to be vigilant about the ambitions that we have. The ambitions and the goals, including the SDGs, were fantastic, but it cannot be left on a goal. I mean, be vigilant about the action plans that governments are to take together with the private sector and civil society. So then you can advance the issues that are at the core of the countries in the bigger stream of the framework. I think that is instrumental. You asked me for 2 minutes, so I'm going to 2 minutes.
Yeah, okay, no, I thank you for being brief. Of course, I think there's a huge amount of agreement on the bigger goal, but how to get there, and you mentioned it, the key word was level playing field and speed. And that is, of course, a very difficult exercise. We're in the midst of discussing this issue both in Germany on the European Union level and also here in Geneva. Business and human rights is a big issue, and progress is going rather slow, we have to admit, but we would like to accelerate that process. Let me ask you a second question. The enjoyment of human rights is so closely connected with the protection of the environment, the fight against climate change and corruption. What are businesses, including Unilever, doing to support integrated progress across these three interlinked areas?
I demuted myself. I think that I want to just, as I integrate this, I want to comment on something. I think that where we can all be much more effective is how we connect and align the interests. For instance, Akusha talk about youth. Well, we are working on youth. Youth is the future, right? And what I see many times I'm passing, including in my desk, is sometimes competing initiatives that shouldn't be competing. If we align all that work and the UN having a tremendous role on that, we will be going much faster. So going to the integration of the agenda to business, right? There shouldn't be also silos between environment and social and human rights and other rights. I think that the work that certainly Mayor Robinson shine a spotlight on the fact that should be fully integrated. At Unilever, what we have done is, starting in 2010, is to really integrate that and integrate these principles in what we call the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. And what it means is, back then, we created a framework that will help us to go from traditional business to sustainable business. I came on board in 2013-14. We expanded to really embed human rights as part of everything that we do. And that comes into the way that we make decisions. I think that we strongly believe in that view. And to give you an example, also in part of our operation, for instance, the issue that we are all preoccupied, the different ways of modern day slavery or forced labor is permeated in many different businesses around the world. No one company can do it by itself. You need to work across the different players to really have that impact. For instance, we work together with the G20 and B20, really pressing to incorporate preemptive and effective mechanisms and to really address government to government, private sector to private sector, interacting civil society, addressing public procurement. It's not just about the private sector, but you need to put it front and central in the procurement, in the public procurement. We work also in safety for women and girls. I mean, we are known to drive that, and we had to look into issues internally, but that gave birth to what we said, the safety for women and girls programs that we have been working in the industry, not only in our four walls, but working in the industry to make sure that we drive that. And we created a blueprint that can be we promote women where they are peer companies or competitors or suppliers or distributors, take it, run it with it. And we work in that framework together with UN Women. And the idea is, how can we create a sea of action? And the premise, not only from the moral side of it, is also from the business side. As Kofi Annan reminded us, women are instrumental for development. And women cannot lean in if they are fearing for their safety or for the safety of their girls. So this premise is how we integrate it. We cannot address deforestation without addressing human rights, both the labor conditions, including the safety for women and so on. So what we look into that is an integrated way, and we promote that way. We understand that not everybody will have the same perspective, but what we hope is that as we move forward, business are measured their performance by triple bottom line, whatever you want to call it, but from an environmental, social, and economic point of view. So we can make that link to the for responsible, sustainable growth. And I think our prior CEO and current CEO, who have been really adamant about driving this agenda. That is where we see how we see the future. And the other element is to ask ourselves to embed everything that we talk in the business decisions. If we innovate new business, again, to Akosha, comment, we have new business models. There is, it's staggering to talk about 1.8 billion youth. Where are they going? Where are those jobs opportunities? And people who are displaced also from automation, we need to create those opportunities. And we know that we are creating new business models, less plastic, no plastic, circular economy. So we need to anticipate and make sure that we open the doors to address, what good looks like under that premise and business model.
Thank you. I'm looking at my watch and we have to rush a little bit, but thank you for your answers. I am now turning to Mr. Matthias Thorns, the Deputy Secretary General of the International Organization of Employers. What is his take on the results of the global survey and on the comments made by the previous speakers? Additionally, Mr. Thorns, if you could also reflect on the following question. What are the key messages from your membership of small and medium-sized enterprises, and how did they emphasize human rights? Mr. Thorns, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you so much for the organization of this panel, which is really important, particularly at this day today at Human Rights Day. Now, let me first of all stress what Marcella has said. Business has no interest to go to a business as usual. The focus is very much on how to build back better. And that is also the result of the survey which we undertook to support the UN75 survey among our global memberships. Our members are the National Employers and Business Federation, 150 countries, representing 50 million companies. And what they are focused particularly on was better education systems, more employment opportunities, access to digital technology, climate change, equal opportunities. So pretty much what also youth and other people for the general UN75 survey responded to. These are also topics, by the way, which we addressed in our Centenary Manifesto, which our global membership adopted this year. The UN became 75 years old this year, and we become 100 years old. We were founded originally with the ILO in 1920, and the manifesto for Centenary is very much value-driven to make sure that we build back better. Our survey was very clear that the UN has a key role to play in that. Business highly values the multilateral system, and we particularly appreciate all the engagement of UN agencies in the combat of the employment, economic, and health impact of the pandemic. The corona has really shown that one country cannot do it alone. There is no place for solo runs, but COVID has shown that we have to work together. And I think that the UN system has very well responded to this crisis so far. It is clear that the human rights are not implemented in New York. They are not implemented in Geneva. They are implemented on the ground. And that is where we see a lot of challenges. I just want to give you two numbers. More than 40 countries did not ratify the ILO core conventions, and more than 70 countries criminalized homosexuality. Now, it is in these countries where ethical stewardship of companies is most needed, but it is, of course, also most challenging. How, as a company, you want to uphold diversity? How do you want to open an open space for your employees if you have to report to law enforcement agencies about the sexual orientation of your staff? That is where one company cannot make a difference. And Marcella spoke about the need. This is not only about companies. This is about creating collective action among all actors. That is what is really needed. And social partners have a cool, key role to play in this regard. Employers' organizations and trade unions, right? They're not only framing labor market outcomes by engaging in social dialogue, but they have the reach out to the real economy, to SMEs. They can build capacities, they can raise awareness, they can coordinate collective action. And we have successes, and you, Ambassador, spoke about it. We have also to focus on our successes. And one success, of course, which is very outstanding, is the end of the kafala system in Qatar, where the rule of social partners was critical. The rule of social partners at international level within the ILO and UN agency, and at national level in Qatar itself to make this change happen. You asked me about SMEs, Ambassador, and indeed, SMEs are the backbone of all economies around the world. So they play a critical role when we want to promote the business and human rights agenda. I must say, from our perspective, the potential of SMEs with regard to human rights is often underestimated. In fact, a lot of research tells us that it is deeply rooted in the culture of SMEs, deeply rooted in the culture of the CEOs to engage on human rights, to engage in these topics. And the reason is not that they fear reputation. The fear is not that they need access to finance, that they have to respond to surveys of rating agencies. It is deeply rooted in the CEO of the SME. And these are, of course, persons no one speaks about, right? No one knows, actually. These are the true business heroes where we don't speak about. It is also clear that SMEs need conducive framework agreements. They particularly need proper governance at local level. And there we focus again on issues like corruption, you spoke about, Ambassador, like informality, and so many others. Ambassador, you spoke about the peer review system in the UN. And indeed, it is very important, but I think it needs to be strengthened. It needs to be strengthened in order to create real peer pressure on countries to engage at local level and to improve legislation. Thank you so much for inviting me for this conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Thorne. Now it's time to turn to our audience, but I'm aware that we are already running very late, so we'll have to try and keep that a little shorter than I would have liked to. We have two speakers, two questions from the audience. The first is from Clement Vowell, the Special Appointer on Freedom of Assembly. Could you ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much, Excellency, and thank also for the organizer of this event, and thanks also for giving me the floor. I mean, I think, yes, I agree with you and some of the panelists that we achieved a lot since the establishment of the UN. If we look back at the First World War atrocity, if we see the fight against slavery, the decolonization, also the fights against apartheid, women's rights. So we achieved a lot. Yes, we can agree that we achieved a lot. But when we look at today's reality, Excellency, I think there are so many things that can make us really worry. And today, if we look how the system that the state put in place to achieve all of this, if we see how there is a coordinated effort from some states to really undermine the system that they put in place, to make this system not effective by, for example, the lack of funding. If we see also how state putting in place what we call today like special procedure, which is the eyes on ears of the system, how, because in many years, the special procedure, for example, that I belong to, were able also to be the early warning system on some of the atrocity and some of the challenge that human rights face on the ground. If we are see how those systems are struggled, add on that, if we are looking at what we already are seeing as post-COVID recovery difficulties, the increase of inequality, the increase of social unrest, the repression of the peaceful protest that we are seeing around the world. If we look at that, let's also be honest that today we are trying to fight to preserve what we have today. And more, for me, my main question is, how do we preserve this today in those difficult challenges where we are seeing that the state that commit themselves, the state that was willing to support the system today, are also the same today that are against the system itself. How do we rebuild? How do we ensure that state rebuild his commitment for the international system? The young people that speak now, there is a hope. They are calling for state that they are afraid for their future. They are the ones that are on the streets. But today we need, and I think personally, we need states to recommit themselves. We need a group of states that take seriously what is going out to the international. And I mean, you will agree with me that the international system is strong as states are willing to make it strong. As strong as states are willing to ensure that people participate. And my worry today is that, how do we ensure the integrity of the system? How do we ensure in this post-COVID recovery, where we are seeing a lot of challenge, that the system is present, the system help people, the most vulnerable, to ensure that the UN is still keeping these lights for hope, for change, for peaceful and peaceful world. Thank you very much, Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. Wohl. I have now a second speaker, that is Sandra Allen. She's a children's rights advocate. Sandra Allen, you have the floor. Sandra, would you like to come in? I can see her picture, but I can't hear her. Sandra, we can't hear you. I'm afraid I'll have to continue, and I'll take one question from the chat box, and then I'll open it to discussion among the panelists. There's a question that is asking, a participant stated that they agreed with you, with your analysis. I think that person is referring to Yvette, that the majority of states are moving in the right direction, though not fast enough. Therefore, is the problem not that we are bad at tracking and measuring progress in human rights change? So it's the implementation question. It's now we have these questions. I would ask panelists that want to react just to raise their hands, because we are running out of time and we still are looking ahead to hear from Fabrizio and his conclusions from this debate. So could I ask anybody who would like to react to both Mr. Boulay and to the question that I read from the chat? Yvette, can I? Yes, you go ahead, Yvette.
Yes. No, the question as to whether or not the achievements, because however small we perceive the achievements, the point about making it known, because otherwise we lose the trust of states, of the community altogether. It is true that there are a lot of human rights problems. There are a lot of problems still to tackle, but we do a lot more in terms of looking at states which are not conforming, and we do not bring to light the positive elements of those that are actually performing. And the Human Rights Council, for instance, discusses, and for good reason too, because it has a mandate that it has to hold countries that are not respecting human rights responsible. But at the same time, there needs to be some bit of balance where states are doing everything to implement human rights. And those states do exist. That they need to be, their success stories need to be told to the world, and that is important. The other 2 points, small points that I wanted to raise also, I think we spoke about freedom of expression. It came out as part of the human rights concerns. I believe now that with the social media, many people are voicing their opinions, they're giving their expression to social media, and people still feel that this is one outlet they have that never existed before, that could be useful in terms of expressing themselves widely. Then also, I noticed that in the responses which they got, 87% of responses agree that international cooperation is important to address global challenges, and indeed challenges within their countries. I'm saying this because in terms of preventing human rights violations, we have seen that even when states have their recommendations, and they accept those recommendations, they are not given the necessary assistance they need to implement those recommendations. They do not have the necessary technical cooperation or the capacity building. And in that sense also, I want to say that OHCHR is doing its best, but the problems of funding is there, and they cannot assist countries to implement those recommendations which they have already agreed to. So the whole question of implementation is important. And I think the international community needs to pay attention to the reasons why some countries cannot implement some of the accepted recommendations. The last point I'd like to make before I finish is the whole question that was brought up also in terms of inequalities. Now, I think the inequalities, the COVID demonstrated quite clearly the inequalities that exist even in the economic and social sphere. We've seen that in many countries, there are certain parts of the population that suffered more from the COVID problem. Even in countries like the USA, we find that people from the ethnic minorities, we saw that Black people, for instance, they suffered more, if you look at the statistics. And this is because they have been denied economic and social rights in relation to other parts of the population. And this brought that out clearly. And then I would say that it also brings out clearly the problems that we have to face when we have to deal with racism, because racism is extremely important. Of course, we can also say within countries to ethnic disparities, but I think one area where the human rights mechanisms, where the human rights system has to give more emphasis is to address the age-long problem of racism, which exists and which, by the way, is considered taboo in certain circles. You cannot talk about racism, taboo. But these are things that we need to address. These are human rights. It goes to the very heart of human rights. And the United Nations system itself has to address this, has to take it head on. It's not half measures. Okay, yes, we do that, but it has to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvette. That's a long discussion, and we did address the issue in the Human Rights Council very recently on the occasion of the assassination of Floyd, of course. But we also recognize that there was racism everywhere. And I had lots of dialogues with African colleagues, and they said, okay, we have racism in Africa also. So we should actually, if we start on the wrong foot and focus ourselves on a particular case, we risk creating more problems than we gain. But I absolutely agree with you. Racism is very big out there. I have one other question, which is very succinct to Marcella Madubens. The question is, what do you think about the nascent steps in France and Switzerland to hold companies accountability? In Switzerland, just 2 weeks ago, we had a referendum on this issue, and it was an interesting outcome because the majority of the population was in favor of taking very strong measures to make companies accountable, but there were minorities of cantons, of states within Switzerland. So the referendum sort of, in a way, failed, but it was still evident the majority of the population said, well, we need to take our companies and make them more accountable. What do you think about these steps in France and Switzerland?
I think that companies should be made accountable in the same way that governments and others. I mean, I have lent my voice and Unilever's voice to exactly that process, right? Of due diligence and mandatory due diligence. So I think that very succinctly is really critical, and will support. I mean, we have lent our voice to it. But I just, if you allow me one thing, the person who asked the implementation question, I applaud that question. That should be reminded to us all the time, and also ask, are we measuring the progress, right? And I think that I complimented also Ambassador Yvette's presentation, but I think that we have great examples that are cost effective in the way that we do it. The work that we did with UN Women that I mentioned, UN Global Compact, addressing one of the most pressing issues, that is poverty and poverty wages, addressing living wages and working together and creating a community of action. That's where we need to do. And I apologize, I took time. I mean, the first question that you asked me, no doubt for us, companies should be made accountable. And the second question is, thank you, we should have more cost-effective opportunities. We don't need to be everybody everywhere. We need to develop good models that then we can lend to others and they can present. So thank you, Ambassador Stevens, for addressing that, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to comment on this.
Thank you. If there are any other of the panelists who would have something pressing to say, and we have actually got more questions in the chat, but we just don't have the time, I would give them 1 or 2 minutes. Otherwise, I would ask Fabrizio Hochschild to make the final remarks. Ilse, you go ahead. You have 1 to 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'll be staccato because we only outline what we will then come back to, but I had 3 staccato points. One is we need to hear the clarion call. Human rights is a demand from we the people. So, and those are the people we serve. So this is the number 1. We take it on board. Number 2, the way we will do this, we need to also hear what we heard on the panels, and particularly our youth activist, very strong point. We need participation, and that of course we have various tools of doing it. The participation needs to be meaningful, not just hearing, but really engaging with youth and with minorities and other groups directly, including also bringing them to the forefront and in leadership positions. And finally, I heard you, Mr. Ambassador, very clearly as well, the need, the capacity, the resources, all the issues we add to it, the political support that is needed for the human rights system to work. But of course, it's a division of roles. We all have our shared responsibility for this, and absolutely, and leadership is needed, and very much in agreement with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Matthias Thorns.
Thank you. Just really 1 second. In Switzerland, of course, it was not yes or no in favor of a law or not a law, because the counter-proposal of the parliament automatically kicks in when the NGO initiative was rejected. So to be fair, what happened here is there were 2 proposals on the table, and the Swiss population, including the cantons, voted for 1 specific proposal. So there will be a supply chain law in Switzerland, which is actually far-reaching, much more far-reaching than at EU level at the moment, just to put it into perspective. Thank you.
Yes, I know it's a complicated issue, and there are alternatives. But the one that got the majority went quite a lot further than the one we are now discussing. Okay, any other comments? That is not the case. So Fabrizio Hochschild, you have the honor of having the last word in this.
Yeah, it is an honor indeed after such a rich debate, which I can't hope to sum up. But I do want to underline 3 points. The first is a point that was made by Akosua, but got a little bit lost in the debate afterwards. And that is that we really need to gain greater youth involvement in all policy-making fora. This was also the chief demand that came out of our UN75 discussions. So that if there was one chief demand, it was that. And there are 2 good reasons for that. One, youth will be a higher proportion of the global population than ever before. And 2, we're living transformative technological change that frankly, the older people don't understand very well. So if we don't put youth in the driving seat, we're likely to turn the world in a direction that really is very poor for the future. And we see the signs of that. We see the signs of a world with ever more youth, and yet steered by a disconnected elderly generation. And that's leading to huge social tension. So that, I think we have to be very mindful of Akosua point. And I don't say it as a personal observation, I say it as something came out very strongly from our consultations. And I think the Secretary General, when it comes to the UN, will make very specific proposals in that regard in the follow-up to the UN75 declaration. And then my second point, I wanted to come back to this question of progress, no progress, that a point Ambassador you made, Yvette spoke to, and also Clement Wule in his comments. I attended a commemoration in Vienna 2 years ago of the 25th anniversary of the World Conference on Human Rights, which of course led to the creation of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And many speakers from all walks of life made the point that what has been achieved over the past 25 years, now 27 years, was indeed unique. There's a global human rights movement that didn't exist before. We have companies thinking, talking, advocating accountability in ways that were unthinkable before. We have the UPR and many other manifestations. But I think it's also true what we were reminded of, that in the past year or two, things have gone backwards. And that, I don't need to tell you in this audience the many indicators of that. And we also heard that from Clement. I would say that some of that relates to political fractures and growing exclusion that again came to the fore in our survey. People want unity. People want us to do more about exclusion. People want less global political fractures, yes, less polarization internally. That came out very, very strongly. And they want more focus on the long term and less focus on narrow, parochial, immediate political interests. And there, I think the key thing is to reposition human rights as a unifying force, not as part of the polarization of debate, as it often ends up being positioned, but as something that contributes to the unity that is the main demand, in the way that it was a unifying force when, in 1948, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was formulated, and before that, when it was affirmed in the Charter, against the backdrop of the war, it was very much seen as a universal aspiration, and we need to bring it back to that point. And then my third point relates to something that Yvette said on education. And while I fully take on board Ilse's point about the indivisibility of rights and the absence of any hierarchy of rights, I think against the backdrop of the current pandemic, we have to recognize that the chief demand of people is better access to healthcare, better access to quality education, better access to food, to the fundamentals. And unless we attend to those, the rest is I don't want to say irrelevant, but is problematic. Is unachievable. So, and I think if we look back on COVID, and there are already work being done by independent entities to look at which governments fared best or came out strongest, especially against the backdrop of more and more discussion about loss of trust in traditional institutions, which incidentally also includes the UN, that we will find that trust is strongest where governments attended best to the basic needs of their citizens, and where health was provided for and education provided. Education, by the way, is key. And I could not say enough to underline Yvette's point. The great problem of our time next to climate change is inequality. The greatest access to the greatest social equalizer, the greatest guarantee of equal opportunity is access to education. And where you don't have that, as in some countries where it's simply purchased, then you don't have social inequality, access to social equality. Where you don't have that, you have massive social risks. So I I think our findings on the one hand are a pat on the back, on the one hand are an endorsement, and with this I'm closing, of what we're doing and the importance of human rights and the importance of international cooperation. In that sense, I fully endorse what Ilse said about a clarion call, a wake-up call, but I don't think they allow for too much complacency by us either. And in particular, when it comes to better integrating the youth, where this panel and you know, the chief speaker being somebody elderly with white hair isn't doing too well itself. We have a lot to do in that regard ourselves. And I think we also have a lot to do to focus much more on inequality and access to basic services. So let me close there, and let me thank you profoundly for this opportunity. And it was also a great privilege to see so many familiar faces, and just wish I could be there with you in person. And very warm greetings, and please stay well.
Thank you, Fabrizio. This was indeed a very, in a way, it was a summing up, because these are the main messages. Let me use my privileged position as the moderator to say one or two things. I think you are right, and Mr. Boulet was right, and I think others reflected that as well. The human rights course is a bumpy road, but if we do not put forward the successes, and the main trend is a very positive one, we are going to give a bad example to the younger generation who we are all asking to play a more substantive, more influential role. I think we'll feel more empowered if we have something positive to show, rather than just showing the negative parts. And on your second point, Fabrizio, I totally agree with you. What is most imminent and most urgent in many countries now is indeed health and food, and some of the other socio-economic issues like education. But health and food are, of course, because nobody wants to die. It's very simple. But our problem here in Geneva is, and that is why it's a constant fight. There are those who are saying this is the most imminent problem because, you know, this is what people are asking for. And then there are others who might be using this as an excuse to have the attention taken away from all the other issues that are out there. And I think we have to be very vigilant not to fall in a trap here. But I agree with those. And I think a lot is happening from a Geneva perspective. I mean, next year, the UN, the WHO has already asked us, the international community, for 5 billion just for the vaccines, to supply the world with sufficient vaccines. And I think that is going to be a very urgent call, and I think huge efforts are being made. And there, a lot has happened already. I think it is tremendous how the international community has reacted to COVID up to now. Of course, we haven't solved the problem yet, but I think we're on a good way to do it. And I'm pretty convinced that in 2 years' time, when we will be looking back, we might see that things have not worked, but a lot of the things will have worked. And that is a different response from what we would have had maybe 20 years ago. So I still tend to be positive and see the UN as a positive institution, and not just because we like it, but because it is producing results. That is maybe something that also our youth delegate can take home and spread this positiveness message. So thank you to all of you. I know that we would have liked to ask more people in the audience, and we would have liked to speak about our Kahoot game, but that time is now missing. So thank you to all of you, and I hope to see you, all of you, back, including in Geneva. Bye-bye. So.